Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you again to this session of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. Today we have Dr. Greg Richards, who's going to be talking to us about analytics-based results management. And this is sort of digitalizing management processes. So we looked at the definitions that were given at the beginning of the conference. Now, Gregory is currently the Vice Dean of Professional Graduate Programs and Director of the Executive MBA at the University of Ottawa's Telfer School of Management. His research focuses on the use of performance information in public sector organizations. He's a certified management consultant and has also been consulting since 1997, working with all major government organizations in Ottawa and some in the US on performance measurement and analytics systems. Before joining academia, Greg worked with Cognos Incorporated, and prior to that at Transport Canada and Consulting and Audit Canada. Without further ado, over to you, Greg.
Thank you. Merci, Bob. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Ça me fait plaisir d'être parmi vous cet après-midi. It's a topic I love talking about. And as Bob mentioned, I came in from industry into the academic environment. And so the research team that I work with is very much an applied research group. We're trying to solve problems for real organizations and real managers. And so as we move forward into looking at these analytics-based results management approaches, we have so far done surveys of 1,000 organizations, 15 case studies with public sector organizations, and we've just completed 4 what I call proof of concepts with a large private sector, a large public sector, and 2 small not-for-profit organizations. The genesis for this, I guess, is the work I was doing at Cognos years ago. We built business intelligence software for organizations. And so one of my roles was to get a good handle on how managers were actually using these tools to make strategic decisions. So that's the inquiry that started at Cognos that I brought over to the university with me. There are a couple of takeaways, 3 main takeaways I'd like to leave you with today. One is a question that was raised by Stephen Burt, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister at our Department of National Defense. He raised this question in his presentation, which is, organizations have a lot of data. How do we get to the data that matter? So to do that, one of the things that I'll present on is this notion of using a results chain as a way of identifying data that are important to the results that you are accountable for. The second question that he raised was this notion of business value. How do we get to true business value? Lots of data around, everybody's excited about artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on. And the question is, what's the highest business value I can get from the data? So one of the things, the second takeaway is, well, let's think about the analytic products that we create and whether or not those analytic products can actually help deliver better business results, better organizational results for your organizations. And then the third is, we can do a lot of interesting things on the technical side, but to implement analytics-based results management in organizations, we really do need to think about the human side. And so I'll use 2 case studies, one for the technical side, one for the human side. The first one is a large federal public sector organization. The second one is a large provincial organization. And just talk through those 3 takeaways by using those 2 case studies. So the first point, when we think about digitalizing something within an organization, and this graph I've adapted from some work done at the McKinsey Global Institute, the identification of where to digitalize is an important element in creating value from the data that you have available. So if you look at 1, the middle part of this diagram, resources to processes to service delivery, that's a pretty standard operational framework, right? As managers, we acquire resources, Those resources we use to conduct activities, so processes or bundles of activities to deliver services, and those services deliver results for Canadians or anyone, not just Canadians, obviously. So that's the first point. We can digitalize this process of data capture in order to make better decisions. That data, as the arrow shows, goes into data stores somewhere. Many large organizations have multiple data repositories. And so the second area for digitalization is this data sharing element that we try to connect data across databases. The third, if you go to the top and fourth, so the third and fourth, that's where the management process digitalization come into play. So management processes include things like planning and controlling and organizing and so on. And so the question is, how do we automate or semi-automate, digitalize the process of gathering data, making strategic decisions, and then the feedback loop in four, use those decisions to improve the operational processes that we have in the organization. So that's just a framework when we think about what to digitalize. We can choose certain areas. Most of my work has been in 3 and 4. And more specifically, those of you who are familiar with lean management methods will recognize these starbursts as areas for improvement that we would normally put on a lean map. And so we're working specifically in the area of the linkages between these things. So the first question is, the first starburst on the left, do I have the right resources to deliver the activities that I need to deliver? So that's the first question. Second one is, are those activities actually meeting the service level requirements? Then the third is, are those service delivery elements actually delivering the results that I care about? And so if you look across that middle layer in the starbursts, to me, the key managerial question that we're trying to answer by using analytics well, so this notion of analytics-based results management, is are the things we're doing leading to the results we care about? And of course, that can be answered in a number of different ways, but that's really been the focus of the research over the last little while. This is just some information on some recent work. This research was sponsored by a company called ThoughtSpot. It was conducted by the team at Harvard Business Review. On the left side, you see the plateauing of dashboards. I'll get to dashboards in a second, but the logic is, if you look at the left and the right, there doesn't seem to be a huge penetration of use of data, even though we're doing a lot of work and everybody's excited about machine learning and so on. Still, when it comes to managers making decisions, the use of data seems to be still struggling a bit. So that's really just a point. It says that even though we are fairly advanced in the amount of data we have and how we can process it, we're still struggling when it comes to managers making effective use of the data that they have available to them. I just briefly wanted to touch on the AI thing before I get to the case studies, because this comes up, pretty much all the time. And as I mentioned earlier, AI is a shiny thing that everybody is excited about. A.J. Agrawal and his colleagues at the University of Toronto wrote an interesting book called Prediction Machines. And in it, they argue that when you think about AI algorithms, although there are probably dozens of them, they're essentially prediction tools. And the important thing about prediction is that it's not only about predicting the future. We can use data that we have to predict a data point that we might not have. For example, in one of the case studies I'll get to in a minute, there were data points that were important that we had no data for. So we had to use data that we had in order to predict what that data might be. So AI algorithms are prediction machines. Prediction is not necessarily always future-oriented. The second bullet point here is another study by McKinsey with about 100 organizations who had deployed AI and machine learning algorithms. And what they found out was that AI delivered the best results when it was used within an analytics-based management framework of some kind. In other words, the organization had experience using analytics before they tried to adopt AI. And certainly when you get into using AI, ethics, confidentiality, and privacy issues need to be considered a little bit more than with some of the other algorithms. But the overall point is, once the organization has developed a culture of evidence-based decision-making, it becomes much easier to adopt AI. So the key takeaway from this slide is, from our point of view, AI is part of the analytic toolbox. We might not need AI, and we know there are a lot of organizations who claim they're using AI, and it's debatable whether or not it's true AI. So we just see it as part of the analytic toolbox, and I'll come back to this point a little bit later on in the presentation. So last point before I get to the case study, the notion of analytic products. There are, within the AI area, there are dozens of algorithms. Overall, in the analytics space, there are hundreds. And so one of the things we learned in our research is that there are 3 analytic products that managers can use that would deliver business value. So the first one is this notion of a dashboard or scorecard that just basically says, look, here's what's going on. And I'll give you an example of this later on as we move through. So the dashboard is, what's going on, and you saw the slide early on about the dropping adoption rate of dashboards. And I think it's because a scorecard provides a little bit more information. So I call them intelligence scorecards. I'll talk about why that is in a few slides. But the scorecard gives you an idea of what is versus what should be. So it gives you a natural variance analysis, so to speak, that should drive action, should drive change. Interesting story, I was doing a project a number of years ago with a large federal government organization, and they had spent a lot of time and money on creating a dashboard. It was really well done, just excellent work. And in one of the meetings we had, one of the senior managers made that point. He said, this is a great dashboard, looks beautiful, all the data looks great. And then he asked this question, what am I supposed to do with it? And so that's a really important point, because I see a lot of dashboards and they look terrific. They have donuts and charts and graphs. And the question, okay, so what do I do next? So that's part of the problem we're trying to solve is, what do we do next? So one is dashboards and scorecards. The second analytic product is association models. So I use the term association models because, a prediction machine is based on associations between and among variables, right? Between and among data points. But I use the broader term association models because I just want to know what's related to what. There's some complications there that, if you're working with data scientists and things like that, it'll get more complex. But from a managerial perspective, I just need to know if I hire more staff, I'll deliver faster service or some language around the association of the data across that operational model that I showed in the last slide. Then the third, scenarios for change. And I think this is really the key contribution to managerial thinking. These what-if modeling scenarios that we can create. We need to do the association models first. But once we get to the what-if modeling, I think that's really where we can start driving some change in organizations to deliver better performance. So let me get to the first case study. So this is a large federal government organization. And the case is really about helping to develop an analytic strategy by getting to the data that really mattered. So let me talk through this. So the first point, the first takeaway I mentioned was use a results chain model to help define the data that mattered to the organization. This organization uses a logic model. This is a very simplified version, of course, but many government organizations have logic models. And typically they look like this: input, output and outcomes, right? We have input that we use to do things to generate an output, which in turn leads to an outcome. So what it does is it provides funding to academic groups to conduct research, which leads to publications, patents, and highly qualified personnel. These are students who work on the project. By virtue of them working on the project, they become trained in some particular methodology. So HQPs, highly qualified personnel. And then the outcomes, so knowledge used for economic or social impact for Canada. And so laying out the logic model in this way, it helps us understand where to look for the data that we need in order to answer that key managerial question. Are the things we're doing leading to the results that we care about? So from a data point of view, the input data, that's relatively easy to capture. Lots of good information about how much funding was delivered to whom and where and all of that stuff. So that's all great. The output data, sometimes relatively easy to capture, sometimes not so much. For example, in this case, none of this data was actually captured anywhere. And so we had to go externally to mine different databases to capture information and publications and patents and link them to the projects that were funded. HQPs, that data was not gathered anywhere. And so and this is a notion of using data you have to predict data you don't have. We had to use the publication records here as a means of trying to define how many HQPs were involved across X number of projects. And this one on the right, knowledge use for economic or social impact, we're still working on. So that's what I call my non-trivial problem. Now, if you remembered early on, we talked about the starbursts, right? So the linkages between the data points that are identified by the results chain. And so this is what I like to call my really non-trivial problem, because what we're trying to do is to link the funding that's distributed to some level of output. So in other words, where do I fund? What types of projects should I be funding? How big of a team, and so on. Because what I'm really trying to do is use the data to get better outputs, right? And then once I'm trying to address this link, the question is there a subset of these outputs that have more of an impact on the outcomes than others? And so mining the data, that's what we're trying to get to. Because at the end of the day, when we present the information, the managers will make decisions about funding differently or looking for different types of outputs because we know they're going to have a better impact on the outcomes that we care about. So that's really the fundamental question that we address in all of the research. So some examples, here's an example of a dashboard. And you can see it's basically static information. It shows the number of projects in blue and the average number of publications across 5 different programs. And that's simply an example of here's what's going on. This scorecard, it's not real data. I created it basically to give an example of the differences between the dashboard and the scorecard. So the dashboard you can see would be that actual column that I've shown on the screen. The scorecard, it's intelligent from a couple of different perspectives. One, it gives more information. We know there's an objective, there's a business objective. We know there are indicators. We define the indicators. We have the target and the actual. So we have the variance. So we know that we're on or we're off target. That's important information that triggers some activity. And that's really the important point. Back to the question of the senior manager. When I show you something like this, it's interesting, but what would I be doing about it? I don't know if that number of publications is good or bad. But here, I have an idea because I have a target. So that's the first point about this notion of intelligent scorecard. The second point is that it mirrors the results chain. The things at the bottom, publications and patents, should lead to the things at the top, which in this case, I'm just putting number of businesses launched as a placeholder. And so just starting with this intelligence scorecard, we have two things to think about. One is what I call horizontal analysis. Where are the most important variances that I see? And the other is vertical analysis, right? You see we're green on the bottom. We're above target on the bottom, but we're below target on the top. That suggests that there may be something wrong with our logic, or we're not producing the right kinds of publications or patents that's going to lead to businesses launching. The scorecard becomes the entry into the deeper analytics, because now I have a big question in my mind, which is why? Why is it that I'm green on the bottom and I'm red on the top? So that's the second analytic product. The third is this notion of relationships. So here, again, this is completely fictitious for demonstration purposes only. Now I'm trying to draw a relationship between the number of businesses launched on the left and the publications, that's on the x-axis. So businesses on the y, publications on the x. And you can see this regression line. Now what happens here is it's being pulled by that one outlier on the right. If I took that outlier out, that line would almost flatten, suggesting that there's actually no relationship between publications and businesses launched. That's my association modeling, right? That's where I want to get to in terms of saying, why am I doing this if it's not getting me the result that I care about? Now, if you look at this graph, it might suggest there's more of a curvilinear relationship. And this is where our artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms become really powerful. This is a linear regression model currently on the screen, but your AI and ML tools can really help with nonlinear associations. And so that's when we get into the more sophisticated kinds of tools, because the data are taking us in that direction. If you had data that were very well behaved and showed good, strong linear relationship, you could just work with linear regression models and you would be fine for doing your association modeling in that way. And so here with the what if modeling now, this becomes the important managerial element of this. The association models are interesting. They show me some relationship between things, but here I now have the opportunity to start manipulating my inputs to see if I get better outputs. What we've done here, a little bit hard to see because it was generated by one of our analytic tools, but so location one, you see it's constant between the two graphs. And what we've done here is we've varied the amount of funds. So this is about $100,000 that's been given to this research team in location one. And based on the association modeling, we're asking the question, if I double that to about $200,000 still in location one, would I get more publications? The number here are the number of publications that are being produced. And what it's telling me is I'll get an extra 2 or so publications from doubling the amount of funding. And as a manager, I have to make a decision. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? As a manager, you would know. You'd have a sense of whether or not an extra 2 publications is really important. But the other thing I could do, of course, is I could vary the location, because I've built the association model across all locations and all publications in all of the research teams. And so I might get a better result if I funded the research in a different location other than location one. So now you see the progression across these analytic products. One is if I have a dashboard, what's going on? 2 is if I have a scorecard, what's going on relative to what I expected to go on. I have a variance analysis. I use that variance analysis to drill into the association models. Are these 2 things really related? And is it telling me my logic might not actually be correct? Then I do my what if scenario to ask the question, what should I vary? What should I be changing if I want to improve the results that I really care about? So this is the same approach we've taken. This is a large federal organization, taking the same approach with the private sector and with the not-for-profits. And I think it has some traction, because when managers start to see the analytic products and the story that's being told, they start to get a sense of areas that they might want to change within the organization. So that's the technical side. Let me spend a few minutes on the challenges of implementation. So there's a technological component to implementation as well, but most of it is really around the human element and the culture of in the organization and things like that. So the this particular organization is a provincial organization, and it implemented an results-based analytics approach across the organization, about 4,200 staff, regionalized, so they're in all different areas within the province. And the technological piece, the important point about it is, if every time we're going to produce the analytic products I mentioned earlier, we have to go through this very expensive manual process, pretty much guaranteed that things will break, right? At some point, somebody will be asking the question, why on earth are you spending so much time and effort measuring what you should be doing as opposed to just doing what you should be doing? So that becomes an issue that we want to stay away from. So this approach basically generates the data in an automated manner. So let me start from the right. So the visualization tool set we were using in the project is Microsoft Power BI. If you go back one step, you see the database. So we had to build a data model that integrated internal. So that's my input data with the external. So that's my publications and my patent data. So we had to build this integrated data model. And then before that, what happens now is, instead of having to go and recreate that database each time, the data are refreshed when we get an email, and this email comes from the managerial team. So there's a little bit of manual work at the beginning, but once it gets into the process, there's some tools in the middle there where it says email, monitored folder, automation server. There's some tools in the middle that captures that file and deposits it into the database, so the data are refreshed and ready for another round of the 3 analytics product I talked about. So the whole point of this is easing the amount of manual work that has to be done, because when we have to go through this manual process all the time, it creates too much extra work on individuals, and it quickly starts to fail, because if I have to make a decision between doing what I'm supposed to do and measuring and gathering data to help me measure what I'm supposed to do, I'm probably going to spend more time on doing things rather than measuring things. So that's the important point about the easing the load, so to speak. On the human side, I like to use this change equation, primarily because there are a lot of change management models out there. But I used it quite often in my Cognos days when I was working with clients to help them understand, how do we introduce all this technology in the organization without creating a huge disruption. So the equation basically has dissatisfaction, vision, and concrete first steps. That's the DV and F, and the little delta sign says it should be greater than resistance, which is the R. So dissatisfaction with the status quo. What does that mean? Well, you need to answer the why question. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to adopt more data? Why are we trying to use data better in the organization? Is it because we're not performing well? Is it because somebody's decided we need to use the data? My experience with managers who are adopting these tools is that we need a verified foundation for why we're doing these things. In the federal government, the central agencies, PCO and TBS, has come out with data strategies for everyone. And so there's a push to do it from central, which is fine. And having worked in departments earlier in my career, there are a lot of things that come out from central that we have to do, and we sort of do them because they're mandated, but we don't actually internalize them. This particular organization, this provincial organization, very much able to internalize the approach to this. I'll show you that on the next slide. So dissatisfaction, why are we doing this? What are we trying to solve? Vision of the future. What will we look like once we finish with this process, using all this data to help us manage the organization better? First, concrete steps. How will we get there? What's the plan, right? A lot of organizations have their data strategies in place, and a lot of the first concrete steps are just getting the data organized. Fully understandable. And then resistance to change, where did that come from? It comes from a couple of sources, particularly when we're starting to use performance information. There is some fear of exposure, right? There is a misunderstanding, we're not sure. There is mistrust, we don't trust the data, we don't know if it's clean, we don't know if anybody who's crunching the data necessarily has our best interest at heart. In the realm of artificial intelligence, there's a question about job loss and the fact that I'll be replaced by robots and all the other things that go on. So there's a lot of things that go through people's heads when they hear about using data and analytics to drive organizational results. So let me show you what this organization did. The first thing the managers who we interviewed talked about was you have to build trust. And the question at the time was why? Well, most public sector organizations are highly unionized, and you normally have the employer, the employees, and you have the unions. Most of them have multiple stakeholders, and so if you're introducing this analytics-based approach, people have to A, trust the data, but B, they also have to trust the analytic processes that are being used. So that was a foundation for the implementation process that the organization adopted. So let me just show you this. So for the dissatisfaction, a clear performance gap. So define a very clear performance gap. And it wasn't a situation where the organization would fall apart, but it was a situation where it was noticeably enough that they had to improve. And so I think that's an important point, is that when you're answering the why question, what's the genesis of this? If it's driven by central agencies, that's fine. But for us as an organization, how is that going to help us improve? And we need data points to tell us. If we engage in this, I expect to see the data point move from here to here. And that's exactly what the senior leadership team, this organization, was able to do. The second part of that was engaging the staff across the organization in validating the gap in a very non-threatening way. Again, as I mentioned, it wasn't a situation where the organization would fall apart, but it was a situation where they needed to make sure they could improve. And there was a long process of validation across the various units within the organization before they settled on this notion of, okay, our key point of dissatisfaction is we're at 3 and we should be at 5, or whatever numbers have been identified. The vision thing, it was not one of these lofty vision statements that we like to make fun of. It was really this question of what's the best we can do. Assuming we all worked in the most effective manner, what's the very best we can do? And so that was the vision. What will our output be when we're doing the very best we can? And people just embrace that very quickly. First steps. Here's an important question. How can data help? They didn't know. And so basically what they did was they spent probably about a year to 18 months dealing with the data infrastructure, getting the right data, getting it clean, and so on and so forth. And then launched a series of research and pilot projects. And these projects are really meant to answer the question, how can data help? So they found some successes. Not everything was successful, but they found enough successes to be able to move forward with the project because they were demonstrating that the use of data can actually help them close the gap they identified at the top. Reducing barriers. So the change management theory tells us that in addition to articulating the D, the V, and the F, that we should think about reducing barriers at the same time. One of them was this notion of trust I mentioned earlier. And so what they did was this notion of third-party validation. When they had to run an analytics process, they would go out to think tanks, or sometimes they went out to universities in the various regions they were in, just to get some validation that the data were cleaned properly, analysis was done properly, the conclusions made sense. And again, this was because of the highly unionized environment. and the fact that there were so many stakeholders involved. The senior leadership team wanted it to be clear that everything was transparent, there were no hidden agendas, and this work was done in a way that is meant to help the organization move forward. So that was very successful, because when people had questions, they could point to the third-party validators, and those questions were answered. Experimentation without fear, taking educated risks. They knew, and they had this conversation in the organization, that not everything that we will do will be successful. There will be failures, and they're willing to support those failures on behalf of learning how to do things better. So experimentation without fear, taking educated risks, and so on. And the last point, and this was vitally important, actually, because when we talked to employees in the organization, this is what we heard: rampant dissemination of results, both good and bad. So if you take the two of them together, right, the third-party validation and then the dissemination of results, and they use these short video clips within the organization very effectively, where the sponsor of the analytic initiative would create a small video saying, listen, this was the problem, here's what we learned, here's what the data told us, here's what we're going to do about it. And everybody in the organization had access to that video bank, so other managers could learn from what some of the managers had done. So that was the human approach. All of the other things I talked about in terms of getting the data and cleaning it and so on and so forth, they had to do as well. But that was done early in the process. And then as they started to do that, they implemented this change management approach that, to me was very effective. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Let me leave you with a couple of final thoughts. The three takeaways. One is we have a lot of data. How on earth do we get to the data that matter? Well, Peter Drucker, management theorist Peter Drucker, said every organization, whether it's a private business or a public organization, they all have a theory of the business. In other words, what are we going to do to generate the results that we care about? And so that theory is in a logic model or some other results chain or in a business plan somewhere. So the first step is, let's figure out what data we need that are linked to the results we care about and to the steps that we've identified that would get us there. So that's the first point. Get to the data that matter by using your results chain. The second point, how do we add business value? Determine what your analytics strategy will be. I've talked about three analytics products, right? So dashboard, scorecards, association modeling, and what-if analyses. To me, the what-if analysis is the most important one. Of course, you probably need the other two to get there. But think about your analytics strategy, because most improvement efforts end up happening at the process layer. And so this notion of looking at association modeling and asking the question, are these outputs leading to the outcomes I want? Well, if not, you need different outputs. And if you need different outputs, you need to change your process, right? So that's the second piece, is having an analytics strategy that helps you understand whether or not the things you're doing are leading to the results you care about. And then the third piece is pay attention to the human element. Change management process is super important. You can take a look at the change equation in the slides, but really there are many models out there for change management. My only recommendation is start planning for that as you launch your analytics initiatives, because often we do forget the human component. So thank you. I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Greg. That was a very insightful presentation. Certainly, I can relate personal recollections dealing with unions, in digital transformation, introduction of new technologies, a lot of the analytics portion as well. The human aspect is absolutely key to getting people on board, and often those soft skills or lack thereof scupper a great many of the initiatives. Now let's see. Now we have we haven't had any questions so far. We'll just hold it. If anybody has any questions, now's the time to pose them.
Yeah, while we're waiting, Bob, I'll add a couple of things that come up quite often. One is One is how does the data integration piece work? Because every time we do this, we have to take internal data and match it up with external data. And that is a fair amount of work. That was probably about 4 to 6 months of work, because we had to find the data, then we had to build a data model, we had to test it, and so on and so forth. So the integration piece is challenging. The total time frame, the organization I talked about, the provincial one, I would say 18 to 24 months from when they started thinking about it to actually having it up and running.
Okay. Well, yeah, data integration. Anybody who's completed a data warehouse, you find all the discrepancies in the data and the subtleties between the various user communities, just simply saying as how many vehicles do I have and what is considered to be an operational vehicle, and everybody defines it differently.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to make an executive decision based on the number of vehicles you have.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I mean, that's just, I'm summarizing, but from your experience, what are the potential roadblocks faced by an organization striving to expand their use of analytics, especially in their digital transformation process?
Yeah, the number one thing we've run into is just a lack of understanding. There's so many terms out there, and they all seem to either mean the same thing or mean something slightly different. And so for the organizations with whom we've worked, one of the things we've done at the beginning is just define things, right? The term artificial intelligence means different things to different people. So one is understanding. So we define all the terminology first. And the second is, how do I use this data once I have it? Like, what do I actually do? And that's one of the reasons we put in this what if scenario modeling, because it makes it easy to say, okay, well, what you actually do is you start to vary your inputs and see if it'll have a different impact on the outputs that you care about. And then you have to go through the change process. So those are the two things we've run into. One is just a lack of understanding of this whole space. And two, just not knowing what to do with the analytic products once I have them.
The second question we have is how can you elaborate a little bit more on analytics strategy development?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did when I was working with the business intelligence company is to work with customers to help them understand, once they have bought the tools, what do you do with them? And I think what happens in a lot of cases is that everybody thrashes about. So the notion of analytics strategy basically says, look, there may be 150 different algorithms out there that we could use. And then we get all excited about the algorithm as opposed to thinking about, what does that look like when I give it to my managers to help them make decisions? So that's what the analytics strategy is about. What do I want to see as an analytic product? I've suggested 3. Those may not be the 3 that every organization wants, but you should have a strategy about, okay, once I gather the data, these are the analytic products I'm going to produce, and these will help managers do X, Y, or Z. It'll change over time, but that's really what the analytic strategy is. What products are you going to produce to help your managers make better decisions?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Richards. That was great. I really appreciate it. And anyways, and for taking the time to talk to us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much, Bob.
Okay, you take care, and see you on campus.
All the best. Take care. Yeah.
Well, cheers. We're just going to wait for the live streaming to end here.
Okay, perfect.